Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one I'll be talking about the Russian summer offensive, which has now begun. The several stages there is to it and how the Russians plan on achieving those objectives on a more micro analysis basis, with the tactics that are being used, the objectives that they are fighting for, and what that means on the greater scale of the developments. We see that the Russian summer offensive, the first stage, has begun. What is the first stage? The first stage is the fighting over important logistical hubs that will enable the second stage of the summer offensive. The summer offensive is going on 3 stages. The first 2 are development stages. The third one is the active stage of the offensive. The objectives in general for the Russian summer offensive is to gain control over the 4 regions. This summer offensive will not end in the summer, so it's more of a general Russian 2025 offensive. The Russian objective is to gain control over these 4 regions by the end of the year, as was stated by Russian Defense Minister Belousov at the end of 2024 in December. He stated 2025 will be the year the Russians achieve the 4 regions under their control by the end of the year. The 3 stages include the 2 preparation phases and the active phase. The active phase is when the Russians will be storming cities such as Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. The initial stage is what we're currently seeing, and that is 3 developments in 3 different cities. The town of Kupiansk in the north, the city of Konstantinivka in the central parts of the Donetsk region, and the city of Pokrovsk in the western parts of the region. And we're also seeing developments across 2 smaller towns such as Siversk and Liman in the northern parts of the Donetsk region. Beyond the 4 regions, there's also a part of the first phase is the Russian advances on the southwestern outskirts to gain control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region with a foothold, gaining control of some logistical hubs for offensive operations in that direction as well. The Russian summer offensive / 2025 offensive plan of capturing these 4 regions in the south is due to the Russian objective of generally achieving their minimal goals for the war. This is in case peace is established between Russia and Ukraine, they would at least have achieved their territorial goals. It will also significantly improve their positions in terms of negotiations in the future going forward, as the Russians would have a better standing point with the claimed territories under their control. They don't have to negotiate that part. They can just say, we already control it, it's out of negotiations. Let's instead focus on the militarization of Ukraine, Ukraine's NATO membership, and so on. The additional goals the Russians have that can only be achieved either by complete Ukrainian capitulation or through negotiations, while the territorial goals can be captured through military gains throughout the front line. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the Russian plans, as they're making it their #1 priority to keep those plans hidden. But guess what? You can do so as well with today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. With Private Internet Access, you can hide your IP address and safeguard your internet activity through an encrypted tunnel, keeping your digital life private and protected. Using the internet without private internet access is like leaving your phone unattended. Everyone can sneak a peek at your notifications or worse. Whether you're at the airport, a coffee shop, a friend's house, or even at home, your data is vulnerable. While I've been covering this conflict and other conflicts, there is a lot of censored and unavailable information. With private internet access, I was able to bypass these restrictions and access the information regardless of the limitations that governments put on us. Private internet access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection through our world-class server infrastructure, which makes your information shielded and bulletproof. Private internet access works on all major platforms: Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, Linux, and more. Even better, One subscription lets you protect an unlimited number of devices, your whole household covered. Install it once, use it everywhere. Stay safe no matter where you are. Right now you can get a special offer, 83% discount. That's just $2.03 a month, plus 4 months for free by going to peervpn.com/weebunion. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support is available. Protect your privacy today with private internet access. Click the link in the description and take control of your internet. Starting with the analysis of the Russian summer offensive, as we are currently in the summer season, we have to look at the Donetsk region, which is the main stage of the first phase of the summer offensive. That is the capture of Kupiansk in the north, the capture of Kostiantynivka in the center, and the capture of Pokrovsk in the south. The Russians launched a combined assault towards Kupiansk and Pokrovsk in the southern and northern directions. While Kostiantynivka, the Russians are still working on the flanks of the city for the operational encirclement. The Russians are also working on the flanks of Pokrovsk, and in the Kupiansk direction there is no operational encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. But the northern and southern offensive operations have already begun. These three towns, cities, are the main objective of the first phase. These all three allow the Russians to significantly bolster their offensive capabilities in the respective sections of the front line for the second phase of the war. The objective of the Russians in this first phase is to gain control over these logistical hubs, as will significantly bolster the Russian ability to concentrate large forces for deeper and more powerful offensive operations that will take place in the second phase. The three phases are to gain control over the 4 regions across the front line. Therefore, we can split these 3 phases into 3 different parts. The first phase is the initial push. This is to establish themselves along logistical hubs, which is the Kostiantynivka, Pokrovsk and Kupiansk directions, where from these directions, with control over these towns and cities, they'll be able to launch offensive operations for the second phase, which is to prepare a operational encirclement of the main areas. What are these operational encirclements? These are a push towards Izium in the north, the push directly towards the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the south, and a push on the flank of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the west through Pokrovsk. As for the Zaporizhia region, it is a push towards major logistical hubs in the Dnipropetrovsk region to cut off the supplies leading into the first line of defense and the second line of defense in the Zaporizhia region, flanking major fortified positions of the Ukrainians and improving their own logistical situation in the rear of Zaporizhia for a push towards the city from the north and from the east. It will also allow the Russians to work on gaining additional bridgeheads across the Dnieper River line, or spreading out the Ukrainian forces for an operation across the Dnieper River towards Kherson. The Kherson region is separate from the other regions because Donetsk and Zaporizhia, the majority of both regions, are on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, while the areas under the Kherson region, which the Russians have not captured, are all across the Dnieper River, which makes it much more difficult for the Russians to gain control of. Therefore, the first objective, the first phase, is capture of Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, and Kupiansk. The second phase is the capture of Izium, the rear of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, the capture of Liman, the capture of the rear of the Dnipropetrovsk region, Zaporizhia region, and establishing a bridgehead across the Kherson region. The third phase is the storming of the Zaporizhia city, the storming of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, the storming of Kherson, to gain full control over all these 3 regions. This 3-stage, 3-phase offensive will be taking place between August and December of 2025. That is at least the initial objective of the Russian forces with the initial deadline. This can naturally change if the Ukrainians are able to show a lot of resistance and prevent a military collapse of frontline positions, establish defensive positions on the rear of their cities, or hold the defenses of cities for a long time. In that case, the Russians will not be able to achieve this according to the timeline, and they'll have to delay that. But it is likely that the Russians are planning this through 2025 due to the words of Blusov at the end of 2024. The way the Russians are launching these offensive operations have switched from last year, and they're now using new tactics, which has been evident on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region, the Siversk and Kupiansk directions. The way that the Russians have been launching these offensive operations has been completely switched up. To see the difference, we have to first look at what they have been doing up till this point. If we take a look at the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, it has become very clear, because this is where we saw the first use of the new Russian tactics. Following the capture of Volodar here to the southwest of the Donetsk region, we saw a specific use of Russian offensive operations. That is an armored push towards a settlement, infantry groups following up to capture the first lines and positions of the Ukrainians in between the two locations, and then a slow push forward in that manner. The Russian armored convoys gain control over fortified positions, infantry go up to consolidate the positions and entrench themselves, and then continue one after push after another. This is due to the heavy Ukrainian defenses and the Russian safe approach to capturing territory slowly but safely to limit casualties and have a slow rate of advance in exchange for inflicting as many casualties on the enemies as possible, while having your own casualties as low as possible. Where the Ukrainian operations were centered around holding their positions for as long as possible, standing and stopping, slowing down the Russian offensive operations, inflicting as many casualties on their enemies as possible, while keeping their casualties as low as possible. However, the main objective of the Ukrainians was to slow down the Russians rather than the secondary objectives of saving lives and inflicting casualties. This is to establish new defensive lines, reorganize their forces, and entrench themselves in rear positions. Now, how has the Russian offensive operations changed since then? We see that in the recent advances here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region across the Mokryali river line. Following the Russian capture of Kumar, we saw a switch in the Russian offensive operations, especially centered around the Shevchenko-Voskresenka direction. The Russians captured Shevchenko, they captured Kumar in the east, and they captured the majority of the river line, following which they launched several assaults. They launched a push towards Pidupne in the north, from Fedorivka in the south towards Myrne, the southern flank of the town, and a combined push from across the river line. At the same time, they launched a push towards Tolstoy, Hrushkivske, and Novokhatske, following which he launched a push towards Zeleny High, captured Myrne from combined assaults from the north, south, and east, and then flanked Voskresenka from the north, attacked it from the east, and a combined assault from the south, capturing the fortified positions and leading into the town. All of these happened with armored assaults, with few vehicles and few infantry. The way the Russians did this is a combination of armored vehicles and lightweight vehicles such as motorcycles and more maneuverable, less defensible vehicles. And these are at a much higher rate than previously, and they also went deeper than previously. The Russians used to launch a large enough assault that they were able to capture the town and then entrench themselves, consolidate their positions, and then move on to the next position. Now they are attacking multiple places with fewer forces and then concentrating on areas that they're able to capture quickly, focusing their forces in that direction and then spreading from that into different areas. That means they attacked Pidupne and Myrne at the same time. However, they saw more success in Pidupne, concentrated more forces in that direction, and then expanded towards Tolstoy and Myrne from Pidupne, from which they then attacked Hrushkivske and Tolstoy at the same time, captured Tolstoy first, and then expanded onto Novokhatske and Hrushkivske. So from this, we see that the Russians are attacking several settlements along the front line on a wider front at the same time with the same forces they usually attacked one settlement. This is to detect the weak point of the Ukrainians, take advantage of it, concentrate the forces in that direction, and then spread out from that direction. And we're seeing the exact same thing on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. Along the river line here to the east of Mirnarad, the Russians launched an assault in multiple directions. From Myrne towards Mykolaiivka and Novoekonomishne, from Myrolyubivka upwards towards Novokonomishne, bypassing Mykolaiivka, from the eastern direction towards Terezene, from which they expanded towards Boleivka, Fedorivka, Chervony Liman, and the northern flank of Novokonomishne, and in the direction of Novotoretsk, from which they expanded in the northern and northwestern directions. Now, how is this similar to what happened in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region? The Russians managed to gain a foothold within the southern outskirts of Novokonomishne and managed to reach the eastern flank, which cut off the Ukrainian positions within Mykolaiivka. The Ukrainians in turn launched a counterattack to the south to recapture Myrolyubivka, to which the Russians focused their forces on the northern flank to establish themselves within the northern flank of Novokonomishne. This opened the road for offensive operations to the southwest. However, the Russians saw success in other sections, so they redirected their forces in those directions, to which they exposed themselves in the direction of Rasene. The Ukrainians counterattacked in that direction, to which the Russians expanded the zone of control on the flank of those positions. So the Russians, instead of facing the Ukrainians head-on as they used to, they're now trying to outmaneuver the Ukrainian forces to constantly attack the Ukrainians where their concentration of forces is low, to flank the Ukrainian positions, and then without fighting the Ukrainians at all, they're simply bypassing the Ukrainian counterattacks and then flanking their positions, where they then defeat the Ukrainian counterattacks without ever attacking it and facing it. Instead, they are just attacking the flanks of those Ukrainian counterattacks. And this has allowed them to advance at a much higher pace and take less casualties while going deeper into the Ukrainian positions, while the Ukrainians are working on a very wide front with limited forces, and whenever they counterattack, the Russians have already attacked a new place, to which they don't care that they lose some territory because they'll quickly recapture them again. The Ukrainians managed to recapture the southern flank of Novokonomishne, recapture Mikhailivka, recapture Mykolaiivka, and recapture Myrolyubivka. Soon after, the Russians, with a combined assault from the north and the east, managed to regain control over Novokonomishne, but this time the entire town, which allowed them to regain control over Mykolaiivka and Myrolyubivka simply by the Ukrainians withdrawing from across the river line because their supplies were cut off. This allowed the Russians to quickly recapture Myrolyubivka and Mykolaiivka without having to fight the Ukrainian forces, and they managed to gain control over Novokonomishne because the Ukrainians left a gap in their defenses due to their counterattacks. And this is what has allowed the Russians to make significant advances on the northern and eastern flank of Pokrovsk over the past few weeks, and this is what has allowed the Russians to gain their first initial foothold within the southern part of Pokrovsk, where they're now fighting over the Shakhtarsky district. In conclusion, what we're seeing is that the Russians have managed to switch up their tactics. They're seeing new success, and it's allowed them to advance quicker at more fortified areas while taking less casualties and facing the Ukrainian forces even less. Instead, what they do is that they heavily bombard any Ukrainian counterattack with FPV drones, artillery, MLRS strikes, and FAB bombs. They also do this on Ukrainian fortified positions and at areas where they storm following these attacks, and they spread out their forces more, taking advantage of their manpower and firepower advantages over the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians are in a panic because they cannot cover such a wide area with FPV drones around the clock, and this allows the Russians to bypass an additional defensive capability of the Ukrainians. Not entirely. The biggest obstacle to Russian advances are still these FPV drones where they detect Ukrainian advances. However, an example of this is the Russian advance on the 21st of July, where we see this significant development over just one day, where the Russians managed to gain control over the intersection here to the north of Boilivka, south of Mayak. This allowed the Russians to drive through gaps in the Ukrainian defenses, reaching through the south of Mayak all the way to the east of Novoshachove, to the northern flank of Suvorove, and the southern flank of Nynakorivka. This allowed the Russians to establish themselves on several positions on the rear of Ukrainian positions, and this allowed them to establish several supply lines, which has since allowed the Russians to now gain control over several positions on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, where fighting is taking place over Nynakorivka, Mayak, Satishok, and so on. They did not establish themselves on the eastern flank of Novoshachove because the Ukrainians managed to detect their forces there, and it was too far from established positions. The Russians did not capture Nynakorivka quick enough, which allowed them to then advance further and consolidate their gains. So this is more risky if the Ukrainians are able to detect them, but if they don't detect them quick enough, then the Russians can make significant developments on their flanks, allowing for future gains that are much safer, and the Ukrainians would then counterattack in other areas, to which the Russians respond to by advancing in other sectors, allowing them to bypass defensive positions of the Ukrainians by attacking the northern flank like Volodymyrivka here to the northeast, allowing them to gain additional territories to achieve their goals in this current offensive. The Ukrainians have the supply lines to the north and northwest of Pokrovsk, the main highway, and the Dnipropetrovsk highway, which both supply the Ukrainian forces and the defense of the city. The Russians are working on the eastern flank through the capture of these settlements, reaching closer and closer towards the highway. First gain fire control, then physical control over it, meaning the capture of Rodinsky is important for the capture of Pokrovsk, while at the same time the Russians have been unable to advance on the western flank of the Pokrovsk because of the concentration of Ukrainian forces in the area, and this is exactly part of their tactics, which is to avoid battles where the Ukrainians have established defensive positions and instead outmaneuvering the Ukrainian forces by attacking areas where they have gaps in their defenses. This is why they keep advancing northwards instead of attacking Rodinsky, because the Ukrainians have now established defensive positions, and now they're working on outflanking the Ukrainian defensive lines, widening the front line, and improving their positions for potentially a push towards Dobropilya or further back towards the town of Treskivka, completely ignoring the Battle of Pokrovsk and completely outmaneuvering the Ukrainian forces. And if the Ukrainian forces continue following the Russian forces, then gaps may appear in their defenses and they can restart offensive operations in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. So the Russians do not have this set objective with offensive operations. They have several objectives, and then they advance to whichever there are gaps in the Ukrainian defenses. In conclusion, there are two objectives with the first phase of the Russian Summer Offensive 2025 offensive. The first is to gain control over these logistical hubs. The second one is to outmaneuver, tire out, and inflict casualties on the Ukrainian forces for the second phase, which follows the first phase, following the capture of Pokrovsk, Koshentinivka, and Kupiansk, and that is to develop the offensive operations to operationally encircle important areas such as Zaporizhia, the Slovensko-Sentinivka line, and to establish a bridgehead across the Dnieper River to the direction of Kherson, for the third stage, which is the capture of these three regions. And that is going to be all for this update and video analysis. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.